On May 8, 1945, the date the world now remembers as VE Day, church bells rang in London, Paris, and New York. Crowds filled boulevards with dancing and flags. Photographers captured kisses in Times Square. Champagne bottles uncorked in Paris, Café, and flower petals scattered in Piccadilly. For the victors, the moment carried sound and color, a release of years of fear and sacrifice. But if you had stood in the fields of Germany on that same day, the picture was very different. There were no petals here, no laughter spilling from pubs. The sky was quiet, too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Roads wound between the blackened skeletons of villages. Roofs sagged into cellars. The smell of smoke lingered, even in towns untouched by bombs. Because the war's destruction was not only fire, but famine. It was in this silence that a long column of women walked. Their uniforms were not polished anymore. The crisp white blouses of the Reich had yellowed. The caps that once carried Nazi insignia now drooped with sweat and dust. Boots scuffed the gravel rhythmically, though some feet were wrapped in rags. They were young, most not older than 25, yet their shoulders sagged with exhaustion. They had once been clerks in military offices, nurses in field hospitals, telephone operators for the Luftwaffe. The regime had called them Helferinnen female auxiliaries, vital to the smooth running of the war machine. They had written the orders that sent trains rolling east. They had filed the reports from anti-aircraft batteries, typed letters for officers, bandaged wounds on battlefields. They had never carried rifles, yet their service was woven into the fabric of the Reich's final years. Now, stripped of orders, they carried only fear. For months, propaganda had prepared them for this moment. Posters warned that the Allies would show no mercy. Radio broadcasts declared that captured women would be dragged into slavery, that they would be violated, starved, left to die in foreign fields. Teachers told their students to swallow cyanide before surrender. Even mothers whispered to their daughters to hide or flee before the enemy arrived. Better death, the party said, than dishonor. And yet here they were, walking not toward death, but toward an American checkpoint. Each step was weighted with dread. Their commanders had vanished. Some officers had fled. Others had taken their own lives. Rumors swirled like flies. Some said the Soviets were already crossing rivers in the east, leaving only horror in their wake. Others claimed that Americans treated prisoners better, though no one dared to believe it fully. Hope was fragile, as thin as the ration bread tucked into satchels. On the roadside, a farmer's field lay barren. A child, barefoot and gaunt, crouched behind a tree, watching the procession. Hunger had made his cheeks hollow. One of the women reached into her bag and pulled out a crust of bread. She placed it gently on the ground as she walked past, never turning her head. She knew he would snatch it as soon as they disappeared from view. Even in surrender, survival had to be shared. Ahead, the glint of metal broke the horizon. Jeeps, helmets, rifles. The column stiffened. Some women murmured prayers. Others clenched fists around, keepsakes a locket, a folded photograph, a scrap of ribbon. A few whispered that they should scatter, run into the forest. But exhaustion chained their feet. Where could they go? The Reich that had demanded their loyalty had dissolved overnight. As the distance closed, the sound of English voices drifted on the breeze. Firm, unfamiliar, not harsh. The women braced, expecting blows, shouts, humiliation. Instead, the Americans simply raised their hands, gestures for the column to halt. And then something strange happened. One of the soldiers, his rifle slung casually on his shoulder, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small rectangle wrapped in shiny paper Hershey's chocolate. He broke it in half and handed it to the nearest woman. She froze, staring at the offering as if it were a trap. Her lips trembled. For years, she had been told that Americans were devils. Devils did not give chocolate. Slowly, she accepted it. Her fingers shook as she raised the bar to her lips. The sweetness struck like lightning foreign, rich, overwhelming. Tears welled in her eyes. Not from joy, but from confusion. Behind her, the others watched in stunned silence. Another soldier tossed a pack of chewing gum toward the group. It landed in the dust. Marta, the youngest of the auxiliaries, bent to pick it up. She had never seen gum before. She unwrapped it cautiously, sniffed it, and placed it on her tongue. The shock of mint made her laugh, a sound she had not heard from herself in months. Laughter. Not fear, not screams, but laughter. It spread like a ripple, hesitant but unstoppable. The Americans chuckled in return. For a moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. This was the paradox that defined the occupation's earliest hours. Years of demonization, undone by the smallest act of kindness. Women who had prepared themselves for cruelty were instead disarmed by candy. Soldiers who had been taught to hate found themselves offering gifts to strangers in dusty uniforms. The silence of the battlefield had been replaced, not by cheers or music, but by the crinkle of candy wrappers and the awkwardness of half-smiles. The war in Europe was over, but for these women, for Liesel with her tired eyes, for Marta with gum stuck between her teeth, for Anna clutching chocolate as if it might vanish, the real battle was only beginning. It was not a battle of guns or armies, but of memory, belief, and the slow unraveling of lies. To understand the weight carried by the young women who surrendered in May 1945, we must step backward into the years when the Reich was still rising, still promising triumph and glory. Their story did not begin in the dust of defeat, but in classrooms, factories, and offices where the Nazi state shaped them into its hidden workforce. From the beginning, Adolf Hitler's regime held a paradoxical view of women. In speeches, he declared their proper place to be in the home, Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Propaganda posters showed mothers smiling with blonde infants on their laps, their faces glowing with maternal devotion. The Nazi ideal was the mother who produced new generations for the fatherland. Awards were even given. The Cross of Honor of the German Mother, in bronze, silver, or gold, depending on how many children she bore. And yet, when war consumed Europe, the state discovered it needed women far beyond the nursery. Factories called them first. By 1943, as German men marched or fell on distant fronts, women filled machine halls and assembly lines. They riveted metal frames, packed ammunition, stitched uniforms, tested radios. Their hands grew rough with labor once considered unfit for them. In the shadow of bombed cities, they worked double shifts, raising children by day, manufacturing weapons by night. But beyond the factory, gates lay another world of service, quieter, more invisible, yet no less crucial. This was the realm of the auxiliaries, the Helferinnen. They wore tidy uniforms, often gray or blue, skirts brushing their calves, jackets cut neatly, caps perched just so, to outward eyes. They looked like office secretaries, perhaps even school teachers. But their desks sat in military offices. Their typewriters clicked not with love letters, but with orders. The Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe trained thousands of them. Some became clerks, typing reports with precision. Others learned to operate switchboards, connecting generals across occupied Europe. Still others worked as radio operators, their headphones pressed tightly as they transmitted codes that guided aircraft. There were nurses, too, their white aprons stained with blood, who bent over wounded soldiers in field hospitals where the air reeked of antiseptic and despair. For these women, the war was not an abstraction. It was paper filled with numbers, charts, casualty lists. It was bandages wrapped around stumps, morphine whispered into broken bodies. They did not fire rifles, but their labor sustained the machinery of destruction. The state praised them as loyal daughters of the Reich. Posters showed them smiling beside radios. Uniforms crisp, eyes shining. Recruitment films promised adventure, honor, and camaraderie. Many young women, raised in the tide of Nazi ideology, believed they were serving something greater than themselves. Others joined for more practical reasons. Food rations, a small salary, a way to escape monotonous village life. And then there was fear. Refusal carried consequences. To reject service was to invite suspicion, to be marked as disloyal, perhaps even as a traitor. As the war dragged into its later years, the role of women expanded further. By 1944, after Stalingrad and the Allied landings in Normandy, desperation turned to decree. Teenage girls were drafted to serve as Flakhelferinnen helpers at anti-aircraft batteries. They stood on rooftops or in open fields, scanning the skies for bombers, reporting positions into headsets. Some pulled the triggers themselves, firing bursts of flak into the clouds. Imagine the contradiction. One day reciting poetry in a classroom, the next squinting at the contrail of a Lancaster bomber. Childhood dissolved under the weight of uniforms too big for their shoulders. Not all women served willingly, and not all served cleanly. Some auxiliaries found themselves posted to concentration camps, typing rosters of prisoners, recording transports, transmitting coded messages that facilitated the machinery of death. Here the lines of guilt blurred. How much did a 19-year-old clerk understand of the system she supported? Did she know that the train numbers she typed carried thousands to their graves? Or did she look away, focusing only on the neat rhythm of the keys? History does not offer simple answers. By the final year of war, the Reich's demands on its women reached breaking point. Cities were rubble. Food was scarce. Families were torn apart. The very state that once promised them honor now consumed their strength without pause. And yet, even as the edifice crumbled, propaganda persisted. In January 1945, radio broadcasts urged women to stay loyal, to resist the approaching Allies. Leaflets warned them that surrender meant violation. Teachers instructed schoolgirls to keep a vial of cyanide ready, even in collapse. The regime sought to bind its women to fear. So, when the surrender came, those long columns of auxiliaries did not march as free agents. They marched as products of years of ideology, service, and coercion. Their uniforms were symbols of duty fulfilled, but also of illusions betrayed. Each woman carried a different burden. Liesel, who had typed orders for supply trains, wondered if her work had fed armies or condemned prisoners. Marta, the youngest, had fired flak into the night sky, trembling with both terror and excitement. Anna, a nurse, still heard the cries of men whose wounds she could not heal. They were not innocent, yet neither were they caricatures of evil. They were, in many ways, ordinary. Teenagers who had been handed uniforms instead of diplomas. Mothers who had been told to serve the Reich before their own children. Clerks who had been taught that obedience was survival. This was the world they emerged from when they walked, weary and afraid, toward American soldiers offering chocolate. The paradox deepens here. The same hands that had stamped Nazi documents now reached for Hershey bars. The same mouths that had repeated propaganda lines now chewed gum from rations. The same eyes that had squinted over maps of bomb targets now softened at the sight of unexpected kindness. History often demands judgment, but before judgment comes understanding. To understand the silence after the guns, one must first hear the echo of typewriters, the crackle of radios, the cries in hospitals, the propaganda in classrooms. Only then does the surrender scene reveal its full weight. These women were not symbols. They were people, caught in the machinery of a regime that demanded loyalty, yet abandoned them at the end. Their story is not one of absolution, but of complexity. And in that complexity lies the heart of history itself. The war's end came not as a single moment, but as a slow unraveling, stitched together by the sound of boots on broken roads. For many German women in uniform, surrender was not announced in trumpets or signed documents. It was a long walk day after day, mile after mile toward a future they could neither imagine nor trust. Columns formed in the countryside. Hundreds of auxiliaries gathered together, shepherded by fragments of command or by sheer instinct. They carried satchels with scraps of bread, enamel cups, a change of stockings if they were lucky. Some still wore caps with insignia hastily torn away, the threads dangling like scars. The world around them bore the wounds of defeat. Towns stood hollow, their windows gaping like broken teeth. Fields once golden with wheat were pocked with shell craters. Along the ditches lay burned-out trucks and the carcasses of horses that had collapsed where they were shot. Overhead, the sky was wide and pitiless. Each step stirred the dust of collapse. Silence accompanied them. It was not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. The women scarcely spoke as they marched. Words felt dangerous. A careless comment could be heard, misinterpreted, remembered, and besides, what was there to say? Their lives had been built on orders, and now there were no more orders left. At night, when they halted in fields or abandoned barns, whispers grew louder. Some clutched their blankets and prayed. Others told each other the rumors that fluttered like moths in the dark, that the Soviets were already in Berlin, that whole villages had been burned, that women had been dragged from their homes. The youngest among them listened wide-eyed, too tired to sleep, too afraid not to. The march toward surrender carried its own rituals. When hunger became unbearable, a woman might trade her hairbrush for a farmer's potato, her fountain pen for a slice of coarse bread. When thirst scorched their throats, they cupped water from roadside streams, praying it was clean. Each small act was a calculation. What to keep, what to let go. The Reich had already slipped from their hands. Now even personal belongings dissolved, exchanged for survival. Sometimes, villagers lined the roads to watch them pass. The faces in the crowd were unreadable. Contempt, pity, perhaps even curiosity. Some spat at the column, shouting accusations of betrayal. Others simply stared, their own grief too heavy to translate into words. The women kept their eyes fixed forward, learning the discipline of invisibility. It was in this march of silence that identities blurred. Uniforms once meant pride, clear belonging. Now they marked the women as defeated. A gray skirt and jacket set them apart from the civilians who still tried to blend into the ruins. It made them visible, unmistakable, exposed, stripped of weapons. They carried only the symbol of service and the stigma that came with it. Occasionally, columns passed abandoned units of the Wehrmacht. Men in ragged uniforms who had also surrendered but still clung to some fragment of soldierly bearing. The two groups regarded each other with uneasy glances. The men had once been their superiors, issuing commands, expecting obedience. Now all were captives, equal in powerlessness. Yet the women's shame felt different, sharper. They had not been soldiers in the same sense. Yet their uniforms tied them to a regime whose crimes were already being whispered about in liberated towns. The landscape itself seemed to mirror their state. Bridges were blown, forcing detours. Railways lay twisted. Tracks pried up for scrap. Forests, once places of childhood games, now seemed filled with shadows. Each mile pressed the truth deeper. There was no return to the world they had known. When they finally glimpsed Allied checkpoints, the atmosphere shifted. The columns slowed, eyes lowered, hearts hammering. The silence thickened, punctuated only by the shuffle of boots and the creak of leather straps. Some women rehearsed the English words they had learned in school. Water, please. Bread, please. Others clutched at small tokens, a photograph of a brother killed in Russia, a letter from a mother lost in the bombings, as if these could shield them from whatever awaited. What awaited, in those first encounters, was disorienting. The American soldiers who intercepted them did not roar threats or strike them with rifle butts. They ordered them to line up, to hand over satchels, to be counted. The process was efficient, methodical, almost bureaucratic. There was no ceremony, no grand humiliation, only the stripping away of illusion. And yet, the weight of surrender pressed down. When the women placed their bags on the ground, they were laying down more than possessions. They were surrendering fragments of autonomy. When their names were written on lists, they were entering a new existence, not auxiliaries, not citizens, but prisoners. The silence that had accompanied them from the beginning remained. It was the silence of shock, of waiting, of not knowing whether the rumors were true, whether kindness or cruelty would come next. Some could not hold it in and wept softly. Others clenched their jaws, determined to show no weakness. The columns dissolved into camps, but the memory of the march lingered. For those who lived it, surrender would always be remembered not only as an event, but as a journey, a long passage through hunger, fear, and uncertainty. They did not march toward peace in the jubilant sense celebrated in Allied capitals. They marched toward survival, carrying the weight of uniforms that had once promised honor, but now delivered only shame. And in that surrender march, history caught them in its lens. Lines of young women walking through ruins, quiet as shadows, their footsteps absorbed by a land scarred beyond recognition. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with all that could not yet be spoken. Fear is rarely born in a single moment. It is cultivated, whispered, repeated until it hardens into certainty. For the women of the Reich, fear of the enemy was planted long before they ever saw an American soldier. In classrooms of the 1932nd, teachers lectured girls not only on arithmetic or geography, but on loyalty. The enemies of Germany, they warned, seek to destroy our people, our culture, our future. Posters plastered on school walls showed monstrous caricatures of Allied soldiers, their hands reaching greedily for German women. Films produced by Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda depicted soldiers of Britain, America, and especially the Soviet Union as brutes. Even children's books painted the foreigner as a shadow that would one day invade their homes. By the war's later years, the message grew darker. As Allied bombers rained destruction on German cities, radio broadcasts told listeners that worse was still to come. The Americans, one announcer declared, will enslave our women. The Russians will do worse. Death is preferable to surrender. These words sank into the minds of millions, including the auxiliaries who typed reports and manned switchboards. For the young women in uniform, fear became second nature. When the Reich distributed cyanide capsules in 1945, It was not only for officers, but for anyone who might prefer self-inflicted death to capture. Mothers whispered to daughters, "Better to end your life than let yourself be dishonored." Thus, when the columns of auxiliaries finally stumbled into American custody, they carried with them a crushing expectation. They braced for violence, humiliation, degradation. The silence that marked their surrender was not only exhaustion, it was dread. And then, reality intervened. The American soldiers they encountered were not the monsters of posters or radio tales. They were young men, many no older than the women themselves, weary from years of combat. Their uniforms were dusty, their eyes shadowed by fatigue. Some had wives and children waiting at home. Others had grown up on farms in Iowa, Kansas, or Ohio. Their lives shaped as much by poverty and hardship as by military training. When they looked at the surrendered auxiliaries, they did not see trophies or prey. They saw tired human beings, forms hanging loose on thin frames, faces pale with hunger. Whatever hatred had burned during combat did not translate easily into cruelty when confronted with this reality. The first gestures were almost accidental. A soldier offering a cigarette to calm trembling hands. Another, reaching into his pack, produced chewing gum, the same kind he had chewed nervously before battle. The foil wrapper crinkled, the smell of mint rising sharply in the spring air. He tossed it toward the women, not as a calculated act of kindness, but as something simple, almost instinctive. "Here, take this. You look like you need it." The reaction stunned both sides. The women, expecting blows, stared in disbelief. One bent down, unwrapped the gum, and placed it cautiously on her tongue. The cool sweetness spread, unfamiliar and overwhelming. She laughed, a sound she had not made in months. Laughter, the very thing propaganda had insisted would be impossible under enemy hands. Chocolate followed. Hershey bars, part of every soldier's rations, became unexpected peace offerings. One woman, clutching her piece so tightly it melted in her palm, whispered that it was the first sweet she had tasted since before the bombings began. Others passed fragments among themselves, sharing the small miracle. The paradox deepened. For years, these auxiliaries had worked to sustain a system that defined Americans as enemies. Yet here they were, eating their chocolate, chewing their gum. The fear built by propaganda collided with the sensory shock of kindness. And something began to unravel. Not all interactions were gentle. There were shouts, stern orders, humiliations. The Americans remained wary. The women, after all, wore Nazi uniforms. Some soldiers looked at them with suspicion, even contempt, believing they had supported a system of death. But even within that hardness, small cracks opened. Cruelty did not dominate the first encounters. It was the exception, not the rule. For the women, this contradiction was disorienting. They had been told to expect slavery. Instead, they were told to line up for food distribution. They had been told they would be killed. Instead, they were told to wash, to rest, to wait. They had been told the enemy would strip them of dignity. Instead, the enemy handed them bread, soup, and sometimes astonishingly smiles. The dissonance gnawed at them. If the propaganda had been wrong about this, what else had been false? Had they been lied to from the beginning? Could all those years of certainty crumble because of a stick of gum? History often turns on grand battles, famous speeches, signed treaties. Yet here, in the quiet of ruined villages and improvised checkpoints, history turned on something smaller. A moment when fear met reality, and reality refused to match the nightmare. For some women, this first encounter planted a seed of survival. Hope that perhaps life would continue, even if it was not the life they had once imagined. For others, it began a slow reckoning, the painful realization that the regime they had served had not only failed them but deceived them. The silence of surrender was never broken by speeches. It was broken by the sound of laughter around a piece of gum, by the rustle of a chocolate wrapper, by the unexpected discovery that humanity can appear in the unlikeliest of places. Fear had been the weapon of the Reich. Reality was its undoing. At first, the women hardly dared to eat. When the American soldiers handed them rations, biscuits, tins of meat, powdered milk, they stared at the parcels as if they might vanish. Hunger gnawed at them, yet suspicion lingered. Could the food be poisoned? Was this a cruel trick? One final humiliation before death. Their hands shook as they peeled back the paper wrappings, as if touching something forbidden. And then the taste came. It was unlike anything they had known in years. The chocolate, though coarse by modern standards, melted into richness after years of watery beet soup and bread made from sawdust flour. The chewing gum released a cool burst of mint that seemed impossibly fresh. Even the canned Spam, pink and salty, felt like a feast compared to the scraps they had grown accustomed to scavenging. The effect was immediate. Shoulders that had been tense for days relaxed, if only slightly. Some women chewed slowly, savoring each bite as if storing the memory for a future that still felt uncertain. Others, overwhelmed, wept silently into their hands. It was not just food they tasted, but the collapse of everything they had been told. Liesel, who had once typed casualty reports until her fingers cramped, held a Hershey bar as though it were a relic. She broke off a small square, pressed it to her lips, and let it dissolve. Tears blurred her vision. In her mind, she saw the rows of names she had typed, the dead, the missing, the never returning. How strange, she thought, that after all of that, sweetness still existed. Marta, the youngest of the group, discovered chewing gum with wide-eyed wonder. She chewed too fast at first, giggling when bubbles burst against her lips. The Americans laughed with her, a sound that startled the other women. For months, Marta had been little more than a shadow, trudging silently through the collapse of her country. Now, in the ridiculous novelty of chewing gum, she seemed briefly reborn. Anna, the nurse, approached the food with hesitation. She had seen too much suffering to trust easily. Yet when a soldier offered her a steaming tin of soup, she accepted. The broth was thin but warm, fragrant with vegetables she had not smelled in years. She sipped slowly, feeling heat spread through her chest. For the first time in months, her hands did not tremble from hunger. The shock of kindness was not only physical but emotional. It cracked the armor of fear that propaganda had forged. Every bite contradicted the stories they had been told. That Americans were monsters. That surrender meant brutality. Here was proof, tangible and undeniable. That reality was different. The soldiers, too, felt the strangeness. They had spent years taught to see Germans as enemies, the faceless source of bombs and bullets. Yet in these tired women they recognized something familiar. They saw hunger in their eyes, not hatred. They saw vulnerability, not menace. Offering food was not merely generosity, it was a recognition of shared humanity. Sometimes, the exchanges carried awkward humor. An American tried to teach Marta to blow a gum bubble properly, puffing out his cheeks until she laughed so hard she nearly choked. Another soldier handed a bar of chocolate to Liesel and pantomimed eating it with exaggerated delight, making her smile in spite of herself. These small moments broke through the silence, turning it into something less heavy, less suffocating. But kindness did not erase everything. Shame clung to the women like a second uniform. Each bite of food reminded them of their dependence. Their defeat, they chewed with lowered eyes. Grateful, yet humiliated. Accepting help meant acknowledging the collapse of the Reich, the futility of the service they had given. Some could not reconcile it, muttering bitterly under their breath that it was all a trick, that the real cruelty would come later. And yet even for them the taste lingered. Sweetness has its own power. In the days that followed, these first encounters became stories whispered among the women. They gave me gum, Marta said in disbelief. They laughed with me. Anna admitted that the soup had been better than anything she had tasted in years. Liesel clutched the wrapper of her chocolate bar as if it were proof. A talisman of survival. For the Americans. 2. The memory stuck. Years later, veterans would tell their children about it. How they had expected hostility, but instead found themselves handing out candy to frightened women in tattered uniforms. They looked just like us. One would recall, only hungrier. This was the quiet turning point. Not a treaty signed in marble halls. Not a victory parade through city streets. But an exchange of food between conquerors and conquered. The moment when propaganda dissolved on the tongue like sugar, leaving behind something simpler. Something human. The women did not yet know what their futures held. Camps awaited them. Interrogations. Long months of uncertainty. Some would be released quickly, others would linger as prisoners. Some would carry shame for a lifetime, others would slowly rebuild. But none would forget the first taste of peace-chewing gum bubbling on a spring day. Chocolate melting into tears. Soup warming an empty stomach. It was not forgiveness. Not absolution. It was survival. And in survival, there is a sweetness all its own. The first days in captivity blurred together. The women woke each morning unsure of what would come next. Some expected beatings. Others feared deportation. But instead, the pattern of camp life began to shape itself around them. Monotonous, imperfect, but strangely bearable after the chaos of defeat. They were housed in makeshift quarters barns, schoolhouses, barracks stripped of their former occupants. The roofs leaked when rain came, and the winds slipped through gaps in the walls. But compared to the bombed-out ruins of their home cities, these shelters felt almost solid. Thin mattresses or piles of straw became beds. Blankets were scarce, so women often slept pressed against one another for warmth. Every morning, guards opened the doors with shouted commands. Roll call followed, a ritual of names and numbers. The women lined up, bleary-eyed, hair uncombed, still in the uniforms of a lost army. Some refused to meet the soldiers' eyes. Others stared back defiantly, clinging to fragments of pride. Marta, ever restless, sometimes whispered jokes during the count, risking sharp rebukes from older women who feared punishment. Yet even that whisper of humor was a thread of defiance. Breakfast was a simple ration. Thin porridge, dark bread, sometimes bitter coffee substitute. The women ate quickly, bowls clutched close, as though someone might snatch them away. Hunger lingered, but it was no longer the desperate starvation of the last months of war. Food came daily now. If never in abundance, each meal reminded them of their dependence, but also of their survival. After breakfast, the long stretch of hours began. Time in captivity did not pass like time in freedom. Each day stretched endlessly, yet weeks vanished unnoticed. To keep their minds from unraveling, the women found small routines. Anna, the nurse, began organizing cleanliness checks. She insisted on washing faces with cold water, brushing hair, tidying bedding. We may be prisoners, she said firmly. But we are still women. Her rules were not about vanity, but dignity. In keeping themselves neat, the women resisted the pull of despair. Liesel, once a secretary, recreated an office out of scraps. With a stub of pencil and bits of paper salvaged from packaging, she kept records of rations, sleeping spaces, even disputes among the women. Some teased her for her obsession with order, but most found comfort in it. Lists gave shape to the formlessness of captivity. Marta turned boredom into invention. She carved small figures from wood splinters, traded drawings for extra bread, and collected bits of colored paper to make collages. The guards sometimes shook their heads at her persistence, but a few even slipped her scraps to encourage her work. For Marta, creation was resistance, the proof that she was more than her captivity. Evenings were the hardest. As the sun faded, silence pressed in. Memories of home, lack of family lost or scattered, returned with sharpness. Some women wept quietly in their bunks. Others stared at the ceiling, eyes wide open in the dark. Stories began to fill the void, whispered memories of childhood summers. Recipes recited from memory. Lullabies hummed to calm frayed nerves. Slowly, these fragments wove into a fragile fabric of community. The guards were not always kind. Some treated the women with indifference, others with suspicion. Interrogations still came. Questions about their service, their loyalty, their knowledge of the war machine. But brutality was rare, at least here. Instead, the greatest enemy was uncertainty. No one knew how long they would be held, or what future awaited when release came. Would they return to families or to rubble? Would they be judged for their roles, or forgotten? Letters were scarce. Weeks passed before the first messages trickled in. Crumpled envelopes carried news. A mother alive but displaced. A brother missing. A husband confirmed dead. Each letter was passed around like a sacred object. Read and reread until the paper frayed. For those who received nothing, the silence cut deeper than any words could. And yet, within this uncertain life, something unexpected grew. Routine. The women learned the rhythm of captivity, the meals, the roll calls, the inspections. Within that rhythm, they carved spaces for themselves. They braided each other's hair. They mended clothes with thread pulled from old blankets. They invented games, drawing tic-tac-toe boards in the dust, tossing buttons like dice. Some taught each other languages, scraps of English, Russian, or French picked up during the war. Time softened sharp edges. Suspicion between captors and captives eased into a wary coexistence. When the Americans passed out newspapers, the women devoured them, hungry for glimpses of a world beyond barbed wire. They saw photographs of cities reduced to ruins, of leaders captured or dead, of civilians celebrating peace. The war that had shaped every breath of their lives was ending, but its echoes remained in every headline. Perhaps the strangest part of captivity was the space it created for reflection. The women had been too busy during the war to think, too busy typing, nursing, carrying messages, surviving. Now, with nothing but time, they faced questions they had long avoided. Had their service prolonged the war? Had their loyalty blinded them? Were they victims or participants, or both? These questions were whispered at night, shared between bunks, sometimes ending in silence, sometimes in tears. There were no easy answers, but the asking itself marked a change. Captivity forced them to reckon not just with defeat, but with themselves. Daily life in the camps was neither heroic nor catastrophic. It was the slow, grinding weight of waiting, broken by small acts of endurance. A braid tied neatly, a song remembered, a scrap of bread shared. These were not grand gestures, but they kept despair at bay. History rarely records such details. It remembers battles and treaties, victories and losses. But for these women, survival was written not in headlines, but in the quiet persistence of routine. They endured not by fighting, but by living one day. One roll call, one ration at a time, and in that endurance lay a different kind of courage. No prisoner could escape the questioning. For weeks, the women had settled into the rhythm of captivity roll calls. Rations, quiet routines. But, sooner or later, their names were called, and they were led into small rooms where soldiers waited with papers, pencils, and questions. The first time, it felt like standing at a border between two worlds. The familiar discipline of uniforms and authority, and the uncertainty of being on the other side of power. They entered the room not as secretaries, nurses, or clerks, but as prisoners. The Americans were not cruel, but they were thorough. Each woman was asked about her service where she had been stationed, what she had done, who she had worked for. They wanted details, names of officers, locations of command posts, the meaning of codes scribbled in notebooks. The questions came in calm tones, but they carried weight. A wrong word could brand someone as complicit in atrocities. A silence could be taken as guilt. Anna, the nurse, answered carefully. She spoke of dressing wounds, of disinfecting equipment, of calming soldiers writhing in fever. Her voice remained steady until the officer asked whether she had ever treated prisoners of war. Her silence then was louder than words. She remembered the faces she had seen, the bandages she had been ordered not to use, the wounds left untreated. She lowered her eyes. I followed orders, she whispered. The pencil scratched across paper. Lysel, the secretary, faced harsher suspicion. She had worked in an office connected to military intelligence. When asked about the reports she typed, she described columns of numbers, endless lists of casualties. Yet the interrogators pressed her, did she know the names of deportees? The schedules of trains, the locations of camps. She insisted she did not, and perhaps she did not fully know. But she remembered the unease she had felt when certain lists arrived without explanation, when names appeared beside numbers that did not add up. Her conscience weighed heavily, though she denied it aloud. Marta, the youngest, faced a different kind of questioning. She had been little more than a clerk, sorting papers in a local office. The officers asked her why she had joined the service. For bread, she admitted. For shoes. To live. She said it plainly, without shame. Though she flushed when one interrogator asked whether she had believed in the cause. She shook her head fiercely, almost too quickly, as if denying it might erase her past. The interrogations were not only about facts. They were about truth, about identity, about judgment. Each woman felt her life reduced to a stack of papers, and the notes an officer scrawled in English she could not read. The uncertainty was crushing. Would they be punished? Released? Labeled as harmless? Or dangerous? Suspicion hung not only between captors and captives, but also among the women themselves. Whispers spread in the barracks who had worked too closely with the party, who had known more than she claimed. Who might still believe in the old slogans. In captivity, hunger and boredom sharpened mistrust. Alliances formed and fractured, sometimes over the smallest details. A glance at a guard, a careless word during interrogation, could turn neighbors into accusers. Yet alongside suspicion, there was solidarity. When Anna returned, pale from questioning, another woman pressed a crust of bread into her hand. When Liesel wept at night, Marta whispered nonsense stories until she smiled. They all knew that judgment could fall on anyone, and so they learned to comfort as much as they distrusted. The Americans, for their part, often wrestled with their own doubts. They saw in these women both innocence and complicity. Some were clearly ordinary clerks and nurses, caught in a war larger than themselves. Others had likely known more, done more, enabled more. Sorting one from the other was no easy task. History does not always divide cleanly into guilty and innocent. At times, the interrogations turned strangely human. One young officer, himself barely 20, asked Marta what she had dreamed of before the war. She blinked in confusion. Dreamed, she repeated. She had almost forgotten that word. Then, after a pause, she whispered, "To be a teacher." The officer looked at her for a long moment before writing anything down. Another guard, speaking halting German, asked Anna about her family. When she admitted her brother had died at Stalingrad, the guard nodded slowly and said his own brother had fallen in Normandy. For a brief second, the wall between enemy and enemy cracked, replaced by shared grief. But such moments were rare. For the most part, the women left the questioning rooms with shoulders tense and stomachs knotted, uncertain of what verdict awaited. Time stretched on. Weeks became months. Some women were cleared quickly, declared low risk, and moved to camps with fewer restrictions. Others remained under suspicion, interrogated again and again. Papers shuffled, signatures were stamped, but decisions came slowly. The women lived in limbo, neither condemned nor absolved. And in that limbo, their thoughts turned inward. What did guilt mean? Was it only for those who gave orders? Or did it also belong to those who obeyed them? Was ignorance innocence? Or merely another form of complicity? These questions haunted them as much as the interrogations did. Daily life continued, shaped by uncertainty. But now, every routine, the meals, the games, the whispered songs was shadowed by the knowledge that judgment lingered just beyond the barbed wire. The war had ended, but for these women, the trial of conscience had only begun. The first letter arrived months after captivity began. It came folded in a worn envelope, the handwriting shaky, the paper thin from too many hands passing it along. The guards called out a name, and a woman stepped forward, hesitantly, as though the sound of her own name no longer belonged to her. She held the envelope against her chest before opening it, as if bracing herself for whatever lived inside. That moment changed the camp. Until then, home had been an abstraction, something too distant to imagine clearly. The women thought of family only in shadows. A mother in a ruined kitchen, a husband marching into smoke, children scattered by evacuation. Letters turned those shadows into fragile but tangible realities. Words written in familiar hands, sentences broken by longing, carried a weight no ration or routine could equal. Anna's letter came first. It was from her mother, written in trembling script. "The house is gone." It read, "But I am alive. I wait for you." Anna pressed the paper to her lips and wept openly, her control breaking for the first time since captivity began. That night, she read the letter aloud to the others, and for a moment her mother's voice seemed to fill the barracks. Liesel's letter took longer. When it came, the envelope was stained, the ink smudged by rain. It was from her younger sister, who had fled to the countryside. "The city is rubble," the words said. "I sleep in barns. I do not know if father lives." The uncertainty was sharper than any answer. Liesel folded the letter carefully, smoothing it again and again, as though by touch alone she could rewrite its ending. Marta waited longest. She watched others receive their letters, sharing tears or silence, while her name was never called. At night, she whispered that perhaps her parents no longer lived. Perhaps no one knew where she was. Then, one morning, an envelope came at last. Her brother had written. His words short and rushed. Mother gone. Father missing. I am alive. Marta clutched the letter so tightly the paper tore. She read it again and again, as if repeating it might bring back what had been lost. Not every letter brought comfort. Some carried news too heavy to bear. A woman named Greta received a message confirming her husband's death on the Eastern Front. She read it in silence, folded it once, and placed it under her mattress. She never spoke of it, but the others noticed the way she stared at nothing for long stretches, her hands twisting in her lap. Another woman, Clara, received word that her child had died in an air raid. The barracks fell into hushed silence when she read it aloud. No one knew what to say. They sat with her instead, sharing the silence. Their presence, the only comfort they could offer. Letters were rationed as strictly as food. Some arrived weeks late. Others never came at all. Women shared them when they could, reading lines aloud so that even those without family might feel connected to the world beyond the wire. A sentence about a potato harvest. A note about a cousin surviving in another town. These details became treasures. They were fragments of a shattered world, carried carefully in memory. The guards noticed the change. They saw how a thin envelope could brighten faces or plunge them into despair. Some treated the letters with respect, handing them over solemnly. Others seemed indifferent, tossing them as if they were scraps. But to the women, each letter was sacred. In the long nights, letters became stories. They were read aloud by candlelight, recited until nearly memorized. One woman described how her grandmother's garden had miraculously grown again. Another repeated her mother's assurance that the war is finished now, and so you must finish too. These lines, ordinary on the page, became lifelines when spoken into the darkness. Yet each letter also carried guilt. The women asked themselves, why am I alive when my brother is gone? Why am I fed, even poorly, while my family starves? Survival felt like both blessing and betrayal. Some whispered that they had no right to complain, when those they loved endured worse outside. Still, the letters stitched something fragile but necessary, a connection between the world within the camp and the world beyond. They reminded the women that they were not forgotten, that somewhere, amid the ruins of bombed cities and scattered villages, someone still wrote their name. And for a prisoner, there was no greater gift than to be remembered. As the seasons turned, the women began to measure time, not by days or weeks, but by letters. Each arrival marked survival, both theirs and the senders. Each absence reminded them of how fragile life had become. The letters were fragments, incomplete and imperfect, but they were enough. Enough to keep hope alive. Enough to remind them that beyond the fences, beyond suspicion and captivity, life continued, and one day, perhaps, they would return to it. In captivity. Survival was rarely a solitary act. The women discovered, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, that they needed one another. Hunger and uncertainty had first bred suspicion. But as weeks turned into months, bonds formed in the narrow spaces between fear and hope. These bonds were not always soft or simple. Sometimes they came with arguments, jealousies, or silence, but they were strong enough to keep despair at bay. Anna, the nurse, became the camp's quiet anchor. Her training gave her a role no god had assigned, but everyone relied on. She checked fevers, bandaged cuts, and scolded anyone who ignored a cough. More than once, she gave away her portion of bread to the sick. We must keep each other alive, she said, simply, as if that truth required no debate. The others teased her for being stern. But when sickness hovered, it was her bunk. They turned to Liesel, who once organized offices, now organized women. She made lists for cleaning duties, divided blankets, arranged seating for mealtimes. It might have seemed trivial, but order brought calm. When quarrels broke out over scraps of food or space, her ledger of fairness eased the sting. If we live like animals, we will lose ourselves, she would remind them. Her stubborn insistence on rules gave shape to days that otherwise threatened to dissolve into chaos. Marta, restless and irrepressible, offered a different gift: laughter. She drew faces on scraps of paper, staged puppet shows with bits of cloth, and once managed to imitate the gruff voice of a guard so perfectly that the women nearly choked on suppressed giggles. "If we cannot laugh," she whispered one night, "then the war still owns us." Her humor was not frivolous, it was survival in disguise. Others carried Kira roles. Greta, who had lost her husband, began telling bedtime stories to the younger women, weaving fairy tales remembered from childhood. Clara, mourning her child, sang lullabies in a soft voice, her songs drifting through the barracks long after others had fallen asleep. Even silence could become a form of companionship, two women mending clothes side by side, saying nothing, yet sharing the comfort of presence. The bonds were not always tender. Hunger sharpened tempers. Jealousy cracked friendships. There were bitter arguments about who received more soup, who hoarded crumbs, who had smiled too freely at a guard. Sometimes, old loyalties or political beliefs resurfaced, sparking accusations whispered in the dark. But more often than not, these quarrels cooled quickly. Apologies came in the form of a shared crust of bread, or simply sitting shoulder to shoulder at night until the anger faded. The camp itself encouraged such closeness. In crowded quarters, privacy was impossible. They saw each other's grief, illness, and exhaustion. Masks slipped quickly when one could not hide tears in the dark or shield a stomach growling with hunger. Vulnerability became unavoidable, and in its exposure, trust grew. Perhaps the most remarkable thing was how women who might never have met in peacetime now became like sisters. A farmer's daughter from Bavaria shared secrets with a university student from Berlin. A nurse from Dresden comforted a clerk from Cologne. Their differences blurred inside the wire. What remained was their shared struggle. At times, the guards noticed this solidarity. Some shook their heads, remarking on the strange resilience of the prisoners. Others even encouraged it, knowing that women who supported each other caused fewer problems. Yet the women themselves understood the deeper truth. Without one another, many would have broken. It was not always dramatic. Bonding showed itself in small gestures. A braid tied in the morning, a scrap of cloth patched into a dress, a song hummed softly while washing bowls. These ordinary acts became extraordinary in their context, proof that even in captivity, tenderness could survive. The women began to call themselves Schwestern sisters, not by blood, but by circumstance. "We are a family of chance," Anna said once, and the phrase stayed. They were not bound by choice, but by the necessity of endurance. And in that necessity, they found a kinship that sometimes felt stronger than the families they had left behind. History rarely notices such bonds. It records battles and treaties, not the way one woman held another's hand through fever, or the way laughter returned in the shadow of despair. Yet for those who lived it, a sisterhood was as vital as bread. When release finally came for some, the partings were bittersweet. Women embraced with tears, promising to right, though many knew they never would. The world outside was too wide, too broken, and survival there would demand all their strength. but the memory of those bonds, the knowledge that they had not endured alone, traveled with them long after the camp gates opened. In the silence of captivity, women became each other's voices. In the hunger of captivity, they became each other's bread. In the despair of captivity, they became each other's hope. And in that shared endurance, they discovered a courage far greater than any propaganda had ever demanded of them. Freedom, when it finally came, did not feel like freedom. The gates opened gradually, first for some, later for others. Release was marked not by fanfare, but by lists on a notice board, by names read aloud, by the quiet shuffle of women gathering their meager belongings. A few were overjoyed, clutching letters of clearance as though they were passports to life itself. Others hesitated, their relief shadowed by dread. Outside the wire lay ruins, not home. The women stepped into a world that no longer resembled the one they had left. Cities were flattened, families scattered, futures uncertain. What awaited them was not restoration, but rubble. In that landscape, memory became a weight heavier than the bundle each woman carried on her back. Anna, the nurse, returned to find her mother alive, but frail, living in a basement that smelled of damp stone. Anna resumed her role as caretaker. Yet at night, she dreamed of wounds left untreated, of fevers that consumed soldiers because supplies had been withheld. She had followed orders. Yes, but had she also followed silence? The questions clung to her like shadows she could not wash away. Lazel carried papers lists she had written in the camp to pass the time, and scraps of her sister's letters. But deeper than paper were the memories of the reports she had once typed for officers. Endless columns of names. At odd moments while sweeping a floor, while standing in a ration queue, those names returned unbidden. She wondered if the people behind them had lived or died, and whether her fingers on a typewriter had helped seal their fate. Marta, young and full of mischief in the camp, seemed at first the least burdened. She laughed easily, scavenged for food with clever tricks, and found work helping rebuild a school. Yet her nights betrayed her. She woke often from dreams where guards shouted, where fences closed again, where letters never came. By day she spoke of hope. By night she whispered to herself, trying to believe it. Others carried grief too heavy to speak aloud. Greta never remarried after losing her husband. Clara never sang again after her child's death. Their silences were as loud as their memories. The weight of memory was not only personal but collective. In villages and towns, people asked questions. Where had you served? What had you done? What did you know? Some asked in curiosity, others in accusation. The women found themselves caught between roles, victims of a war they had not chosen, but also participants in a system they had sustained. The line between guilt and innocence blurred, and in that blur lay unease. Many chose silence. They spoke of hunger, of captivity, of the kindness of strangers, but not of the darker questions. Memories became private burdens, locked away behind polite words. Some carried them for decades, never telling even their children, and yet silence did not erase the past. It lived in gestures, in the way Anna always overstocked medicine, in the way Liesel never again touched a typewriter, in the way Marta flinched at the sound of boots on cobblestones. Memory was carried in the body, even when unspoken. Still, there were moments of light. Bonds formed in captivity sometimes endured in freedom. A few women managed to find one another again, meeting over coffee in shattered cities, reminiscing about roll calls and whispered songs. They laughed, incredulous at how absurd it seemed now. That chewing gum or a scrap of chocolate had once felt like salvation. They wept too, remembering those who had not returned. The war had demanded of them a silent courage one rarely celebrated, one often forgotten. They had not fought on front lines, yet they had endured battles of hunger, suspicion, memory. Their courage was quieter, less visible, but no less real. The weight of memory was not something they shed. It became part of them, shaping the way they raised children, the way they trusted neighbors, the way they prayed at night. Some memories softened with time, edges blunted by years. Others remained sharp, cutting across decades. History tends to remember noise guns, speeches, treaties, but the women carried silence, and within that silence lived a story of endurance, of shame and dignity entwined, rules of survival at a cost too heavy to measure. The war ended on paper, but within these women, it never truly ended. It walked beside them in every step, whispered in every pause, lingered in every unspoken word. They had carried the Reich on their shoulders when young. Now, older, they carried its ruins in their hearts. And that was their lasting burden. To live with memory, to live after, to live on. Freedom, when it came, was not the end of struggle but the beginning of another. The women stepped back into villages that barely recognized them. Streets they had once walked now lay in ruins. Neighbors who had once smiled now looked with suspicion. The uniforms of war had been stripped away, but the stains of association lingered. For some, there was an expectation of gratitude. You survived. You should be thankful. But thankfulness was hard to summon when survival came hand in hand with shame. The women who had worked in offices, in kitchens, in laundry rooms of the camps carried an invisible mark, even if they had only followed orders, even if they had been prisoners themselves in all but name. Suspicion clung to them. Anna tried to resume her nursing, yet patients sometimes looked at her with wary eyes. They whispered, was she the nurse who tended soldiers? Who kept them strong to fight longer? She could not always answer, because the truth was tangled. Yes, she had healed wounds. And yes, she had withheld medicine when supplies were taken from her hands. Every action in war had been double-edged. Laisel sought work in an office again, but typewriters became her enemies. Each click of the keys echoed the names she had once recorded. Employers, too, questioned her past. Had she typed orders that sent people to their deaths? She could not prove she hadn't. The machine that had once given her a role now shut doors against her. Marta seemed better suited to survival. She was young, quick to adapt, willing to scrub floors or mend clothes. Yet in the marketplace, older women gossiped. They whispered that her laughter was too loud, too careless for someone who had seen the inside of camps. Whispers suggested she had done something to survive, that perhaps she had been favored, perhaps compromised. Stigma wore many masks, and Marta could not outrun them all. Some women found their families unwilling to ask questions, afraid of what answers might reveal. Others faced coldness. Relatives who resented that they had returned, while sons, brothers, husbands had not. Survival itself became suspicious, as though returning alive was proof of guilt. Daily life was marked by shortages. Coal was scarce, bread was rationed, clothing patched and repatched. To survive the war was one thing, to survive the peace was another. Yet the women pressed on trading on black markets, planting gardens in bombed-out courtyards, sewing coats from blankets. Their ingenuity became their shield, their quiet rebellion against despair. Marriage offered some a way forward, though it was not always chosen freely. A widow might marry again out of necessity, securing food and shelter for her children. A young woman might wed a soldier returning from the front. both clinging to the illusion of normal life. But trust came slowly. For how could one explain the silence of captivity, the compromises of survival, the shadows that walked behind them? Children, too, bore the weight of unspoken histories. Some grew up never knowing what their mothers had endured. Others sensed the silence, piecing together fragments of conversations overheard. A mother's refusal to waste food, her fear of uniforms, her sudden tears at the sound of marching feet, all these became part of the inheritance of war. In public, the women moved carefully. In private, they wrestled with questions that had no answers. Were they guilty for obeying? Were they innocent for having no choice? Could they claim victimhood when others had suffered worse? Society, eager to move forward, often chose not to listen. The narrative of rebuilding left little space for the gray truths of these women's lives. They became invisible again, this time not by force, but by neglect. Yet invisibility could also be a kind of protection. In their silence, the women created spaces of survival. They baked bread. They raised children. They lit candles at church altars. Small acts of continuity became their quiet defiance. To live was to rebuild, piece by piece, even without applause. To endure was to accept that stigma and suspicion would never fully lift. But within the walls of kitchens, within the soft lullabies sung to children, within the steadfast care for the fragile and the sick, they carried on. The war had taken their voices. Peace gave them little chance to speak. But in the spaces between judgment and survival, they found a way to live. And sometimes, late at night, they told one another the truth, whispered in kitchens, shared across cups of bitter coffee, exchanged in letters folded small. In those confessions, they found fragments of freedom, because survival, even in silence, was still survival. History, as it was written after the war, had little room for the voices of women who had endured its silences. The official documents filled shelves with numbers, troop movements, treaties, and the speeches of generals. The newspapers printed headlines about battles won and borders redrawn. Museums displayed uniforms and weapons, medals and flags. But the quiet testimonies of women, the ones who had carried water, whispered songs, buried children, and returned with scars unseen were rarely asked for, rarely recorded, rarely believed. Anna once tried to speak. A visiting historian asked her about her years in the camp. She began to tell him about the shortages of medicine, about the fever that spread through barracks, about the helplessness of watching patients fade. He interrupted, asking instead for details about guards, about cruelty, about numbers of dead. When she could not provide statistics, he closed his notebook. Her lived truth did not fit the record he wanted. Liesel, too, attempted testimony. She wrote a letter to a local newspaper, speaking of her fear, her regret, her endless nights of remembering the names she had once typed. The letter was never printed. Perhaps it seemed unpatriotic, perhaps too ambiguous, neither a tale of heroism nor a clear confession of guilt. In the black and white world of post-war narratives, her gray truths had no place. Marta shared her memories only in fragments. To neighbors, she joked about the camp, telling half-truths in a tone light enough to deflect judgment. To her children, she said almost nothing, only that it was a hard time. She feared that if she told the full story, no one would understand, or worse, they would blame her for surviving. Greta kept silent altogether. She lit candles in church each week. Her prayers, unspoken words of memory. She carried in her body the loss of her husband, the endless hunger of captivity, the shame of suspicion upon return. But she left no diary, no testimony. When she died, her story died with her. And this was the fate of so many women. Their testimonies were unheard, not because they had nothing to say, but because no one asked, or because what they said did not fit the narrative others wished to hear. History preferred stories of bravery that were easy to admire, or crimes that were easy to condemn. It preferred noise over silence, clarity over complexity. But women's stories were seldom so simple. They were stories of compromise, of endurance, of shame, interwoven with dignity. They were stories that blurred the line between victim and participant, between guilt and survival. Some women did write diaries, hidden in drawers, never shown to families. Decades later, a few of these emerged fragile pages filled with trembling handwriting. They spoke of cold mornings when the bread ration was smaller than a hand, of mothers sewing scraps into makeshift shoes, of children learning to count by tallying days until liberation. But most diaries were burned or lost, destroyed in fear that they might be discovered and used against their authors. Others left no words but only habits hoarding food, mistrusting officials, clinging to scraps of cloth or buttons as though they held power. These habits, too, were testimonies, though historians often overlooked them. To be unheard is a second kind of captivity. The war had taken women's freedom. Peace denied them recognition. Yet within kitchens and living rooms, in whispers between sisters or friends, their testimonies did live on. Oral histories, passed not to scholars but to daughters and granddaughters, carried fragments of truth. We stood in line all day for potatoes. We buried the blanket with her. We sang under our breath so the guards would not hear. These were not the stories of generals, but they were the stories of life. And slowly, as years turned to decades, a few voices began to surface. Younger historians, sometimes women themselves, began asking different questions. They wanted not only numbers but feelings, not only dates but memories. They listened with patience, allowing silence to stretch until words emerged. And in that listening, long-buried testimonies began to breathe again. Still, countless stories remain unheard, buried with those who carried them. The archives of silence are larger than the archives of paper. And yet, even without being written, these testimonies mattered. They shaped the way families lived, the way towns rebuilt, the way generations after the war understood hunger, fear, resilience. What history did not record still left traces woven into lullabies, into recipes stretched thin, into rituals of mourning never explained. The women's testimonies live not only in books, but in gestures, in silences, in the persistence of memory itself. To listen, even now, is to honor what was nearly lost, because the women did speak. It was history that chose not to listen. The women who returned from camps, who endured suspicion and scarcity, often chose not to tell their stories. Sometimes they chose silence deliberately, fearing judgment. Sometimes silence was chosen for them, dismissed by officials, ignored by neighbors, lost among the noise of rebuilding nations. Yet silence itself became a kind of inheritance, passed from mother to child, from grandmother to grandchild. In kitchens where bread was sliced thin, children grew up sensing the shadows that hung over mealtimes. A mother who scolded them harshly for wasting crumbs was not simply thrifty, she was remembering years when crumbs were the difference between life and death. To the children, the rule felt strict. Only later did they learn it was born of hunger. In homes where closets bulged with jars of preserved food, daughters grew up believing their mothers were simply anxious. Only with time did they understand that the hoarding was memory turned habit, a quiet insurance against the return of famine. The silence of the women was never empty. It was full of signals, gestures, habits. Children absorbed them without words. A mother who avoided uniforms, who never sat near a window when boots clicked on the street outside, who never laughed at the sound of marching songs. These small refusals became part of family life, even if the reasons were left unsaid. For some children, the silence bred distance. They grew up frustrated, sensing the weight of something hidden but never explained. They asked questions. Where were you during the war? And received evasions. It was a hard time. Best not to remember. The children grew, carrying not the facts of history but the gaps, the omissions, the unspoken wounds. Others inherited not silence but fragments. A whispered story here, a stray photograph there, a sudden confession after a sleepless night. These fragments rarely formed a full picture. They were like pieces of a puzzle with most of the image missing. Yet even fragments shaped identity. A daughter who learned her mother had once been in a camp understood her differently. A granddaughter who discovered a hidden diary saw strength where before she saw mystery. Over time, silence itself became a kind of legacy, shaping the resilience of those who followed. Many of the women's children grew up cautious but resourceful, learning to read between words, to sense danger, to carry responsibility early. Some became protectors in their own right, determined to shield their families from hardship as their mothers once had. But silence could also wound. Families sometimes fractured under the weight of secrets unspoken. Children who did not understand their mother's fears mistook them for coldness. Grandchildren puzzled over why family gatherings carried an undercurrent of tension. Silence, left unexplained, could be as heavy as memory itself. In later decades, as societies began to reckon more openly with the war, grandchildren often became the first listeners. They asked questions their parents had not dared to. They brought tape recorders, notebooks, cameras. They urged their grandmothers to speak, to leave a testimony before it was too late. And sometimes, after years of quiet, the women did. A grandmother who had never spoken to her children told her story to a university student collecting oral histories. A woman who had never admitted to her husband that she worked in a camp office finally told her granddaughter, late at night, with tears in her eyes. These late testimonies became gifts, fragile and incomplete, but precious. The legacy of silence, then, was double-edged. It hid truths, but it also protected. It burdened, but it also sustained. It denied children answers, but it gave them resilience. And through silence, something else was passed down. The knowledge that survival is not always loud, that courage is not always celebrated, that endurance is sometimes quiet and unseen. Generations born long after the guns fell silent still carry these lessons. They inherit not only what was said, but what was withheld. They live with the echoes of silence, and in those echoes, they find both mystery and strength. For silence, too, is a story, and it is one that continues to shape lives long after the women themselves are gone. For decades, the courage of women during the wars lingered in silence, known only in kitchens, in lullabies, in the careful way bread was rationed. But as time passed, silence began to loosen. It began quietly through local initiatives, through small exhibitions in village halls, through the questions of curious grandchildren who wanted to know why their grandmother's hands trembled when they heard marching songs. Oral historians started to listen not only to generals and politicians, but to the voices of ordinary women whose lives had been shaped by hunger, suspicion, and endurance. What they found was not the story of battlefield heroics, but of another kind of courage. The courage to endure hunger without breaking, to raise children in ruins, to carry memories without collapsing under their weight. Anna's story, once dismissed by a hurried historian, was later recorded by a younger scholar who sat with her for hours, listening as she described the camp infirmary, the patients she had lost, the choices that haunted her. Anna cried, but she also spoke with relief, as if at last someone had allowed her pain to exist. Liesel's letters, never printed in her lifetime, were found decades later by her granddaughter in a box of yellowed papers. They were read aloud at a local remembrance event, where listeners fell silent, struck by her honesty. She had written not of glory or guilt alone, but of confusion, survival, and the terrible ambiguity of living through a war that spared no conscience. Marta, who had joked away her trauma in her youth, finally spoke openly in her old age. She laughed as she described smuggling scraps of food, but her laughter gave way to tears when she admitted how often she had dreamed of fences closing in. Her testimony became part of an oral history archive, preserved for future generations. For many women, recognition came too late. Greta, who had lit candles in silence all her life, died without ever sharing her memories. Yet even she was remembered, not by testimony, but by the rituals she left behind, the way she had prayed for the lost, the way she had taught her children to give thanks for every loaf of bread. In those habits lay her unspoken courage. Recognition also grew on a larger scale. In Germany, in Poland, in France, memorials were erected not only to soldiers, but to civilians. Women's labor in the ruins, women's survival in the camps, women's quiet rebuilding of homes began to be acknowledged. Historians started using words like everyday heroism to describe the acts of endurance once dismissed as ordinary. School children read not only about generals, but about mothers who kept families alive with gardens planted in bomb craters. Museums displayed not only uniforms and weapons, but sewing needles, ration books, faded photographs of women working amid rubble. And yet, recognition was never complete. Some stories remained hidden, buried with those who carried them. Some testimonies, even when heard, were doubted or softened by listeners who preferred clearer lines between guilt and innocence. But the very act of listening, truly listening, was itself a form of justice. It gave dignity to the silences, acknowledged that endurance was courage, that survival was not shame. In remembrance ceremonies, women's names were spoken aloud. In local archives, their testimonies were preserved. In family circles, grandchildren carried forward their grandmother's stories, ensuring that silence would not swallow them whole. And so, from silence, recognition began to grow. Not all at once, not everywhere, and never fully, but enough to show that women's courage, though long overlooked, was real. Their strength was not forged in battlefields, but in barracks, in queues, in kitchens. It was the strength to persist, to bear hunger, to rebuild from rubble, to carry memory with dignity. It was the kind of courage history almost forgot until listening, at last, allowed it to be remembered. History is often told in noise, in battles shouted across fields, in speeches broadcast from podiums, in treaties signed with fanfare. Yet beneath that noise runs a quieter current, one woven not from gunfire or parades, but from the steady endurance of those whose names rarely appear in books. The women who lived through the world wars carried such endurance. Their courage was not the kind sung in anthems, nor carved into stone memorials. It was courage lived in silence, in the tending of wounds without medicine, in the mending of clothes too thin for winter, in the steady hand that guided a child through rubble. Some of these women spoke, their words finally recorded, their testimonies preserved. Others remained silent to the end, their stories carried only in gestures, in habits, in the whispered memories of families. But together, they formed a chorus too quiet to hear in its time, yet strong enough to echo across generations. Their courage was silent, but silence is not the same as absence. Silence can carry weight. Silence can resist forgetting. Silence can become its own kind of testimony. In their silence, they rebuilt homes. In their silence, they buried grief and tended life. In their silence, they taught children to endure scarcity, to honor bread, to distrust cruelty. These lessons did not enter history books. Yet they shaped the future as surely as treaties and armistices. Now, as we look back, the tapestry of history appears incomplete without them. The bright threads of battles and leaders are interwoven with threads softer, fainter threads of women whose courage was lived not in glory but in persistence. Without those threads, the fabric would fray. To remember them is not only to honor the past, but to see the present more clearly. For silent courage still exists in refugee camps, in families divided by war, in those who hold together life when the world seems to fall apart. The form may change, but the essence remains, the quiet endurance that sustains when louder forces destroy. The women of the world wars did not choose their roles. War pressed them into silence, into suspicion, into survival. Yet they carried that burden with strength that history nearly overlooked. Now, to speak their names, to tell their stories, to listen, where once we ignored this, is to complete the tapestry. And in the end, what we learn from them is simple. Courage is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it is invisible. Sometimes it is carried within, across a lifetime, across generation. But it is courage all the same.